From the lab to your ears, you're listening to WonderLabs.
Hello, and welcome to WonderLabs. This is Chris Richardson, checking in from London town. I'm sceptical about how we're allocating our aggregate intellectual capital. Many of my smart friends have dedicated themselves to finance, law, and coding, which is great. But I can't help but feel there's more to life than derivative securities, patent disputes, and digital plumbing. Are these the industries that should be hoovering up our best and brightest minds? Would our world be a better place if at least some of these people were motivated by something other than salary and status? Meaning, perhaps. Maybe. Or maybe my own values are out of whack. Anyway, I've spent the last few months grappling with my grip on reality. I'm never quite sure whether my criticism of the industries that scream the loudest verges on absurd conspiratorial thinking, or whether there's something more to it. But a good sense check for me has always been my good friend, Dr. Duncan Fraser. Duncan first appeared on WonderLabs back in Season 1, while he was finishing up a PhD at Oxford. He was exploring new catalysts that could assist in creating biodegradable plastics, but he's since become disillusioned with the limited options available in academia and switched to a career in data science, not to be confused with digital plumbing. In this episode, we cover the fundamentals of data science, how it can be applied to solve useful problems in energy storage, and the benefits of data-led decision-making. We also talk about the current state of battery technology, creating the right incentives in power markets, and, ultimately, how Duncan thinks working on energy storage can push him towards his ultimate goal, preventing the looming environmental apocalypse. Before the conversation, I was concerned that this pursuit might be another waste of our aggregate intellectual capital. But by the end, I was more confident that what Duncan is doing might have at least a little more to offer than derivative securities and patent disputes, particularly if he can apply what he's doing to climate change. I also remembered that I should probably have more faith in my friends and their life choices. Duncan is one of the most intelligent, thoughtful people I know. He's also the closest thing I've met to a Renaissance polymath, able to turn his attention to musical composition, organic chemistry, renewable energy, and the Rubik's Cube, inevitably with great success. It's always a pleasure to sit down and speak with him, and I'm glad that we could get him back on the show. I'm sure he'll be back on again soon with another wild and unexpected venture. But until then, I hope you enjoy this conversation on data science. And we're recording. Dr. Duncan Fraser, welcome back.
It's good to be here.
So it's a beautiful Saturday afternoon in sunny South London, and we're out in the park today because you've been sat tinkering away in Python behind a screen indoors for too long, so we thought we'd get you out and get some fresh air today.
With Python, the computer language.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Not my
Not
Python.
the pet snake.
Oh.
So, the crows and the wind and the screaming children and the reggaeton, I think it all adds to the richness of the conversation. Won't detract from the interesting things that you have to say.
Yeah, it's a beautiful spot.
Yeah, so the last time we spoke, you were working on plastics. So that's all taken care of then?
Oh, plastics finished, yeah.
Solved.
Solved.
Where did you get to at the end of that postdoctorate work you were doing?
Yeah, so we were developing new catalysts that would be making biodegradable plastics using CO2 as a feedstock, and we had a great time. We made a whole bunch of new catalysts that were chemically interesting, and some of them were very fast, but certainly nothing that's going to be changing the world anytime soon. But I had a blast. That work is still ongoing in the group that I left. There's still plenty of work to be done on biodegradable plastics, I think.
So now that you're not beholden to your Thai oil overlords, I would never ask you to say anything bad about a former employer, but I'm just curious as to what your opinions are on the interaction between academia and business now that you're able to view it from the outside.
Thanks, Chris. So, ultimately, I think fewer people would be given the opportunity to do PhDs if there wasn't that industrial collaboration. So, in that sense, that's a good thing. More people doing PhDs is good for the research ecosystem, it's good for the skills that they come out the other side with, and it's good for the publications that people are able to dig into in the future. I think there's a different research objective often when you're doing industrially funded work, and this isn't the truth for all industrially funded work, but depending on the level of involvement the sponsor wants to have, you might just have to answer some less interesting questions.
Sure.
I think that is not necessarily the most ideal thing, but that isn't a pressure that's coming from industry. I think there is just in general a pressure for people working in research environments to be addressing questions that are less fundamentally driven and more application driven. And maybe that's not a bad thing, but we should leave space for both.
So that's interesting, because when I first met you, we used to debate this point, the relative importance of knowledge for knowledge's sake versus what is applicable. And I think the journey that I've seen you go on over time is one from an idealist to a pragmatist. And I don't think that's a bad thing either, but it's just been interesting to observe. So, okay, that was more just for some continuity as to where we left things off the last time you were on, but you have now left academia. Why the switch?
Yeah, so I left academia because often it doesn't feel like in academia you're kind of the master of your own destiny. I think you end up with a lot of these situations where your future career prospects turn on the decisions of real non-specialists, and you might be really good, you might be really talented, you might be capable of doing great things, and that's definitely not to say that's what I was at all. But I think there are lots of cases where you could be very capable, but you happen to find yourself in a situation where a panel of non-specialists don't like your ideas, and you end up not getting the funding that you need to build your group at a pivotal moment, and your group collapses, all that institutional knowledge disappears, and your career as an academic is now much less successful. I didn't like the idea that that was something that could be in my future, and so for some people that risk-reward makes sense, because the reward of getting to work in research is worth it. But for me, I wanted to be a master of my own destiny, and so academia feels like a difficult place to make that happen.
So now you're a master of your own destiny in the private sector. So let's segue into that. How do the skills that you developed in academia translate into a business environment?
I think basically everything just comes down to being pretty chill, not knowing what's going on. Like, if you have done a PhD, you've probably had to dig into some difficult to understand problems and not knowing where you're ending up. And you can, if you're someone who can do that in a business context, then I think you're going to do pretty well there. That's the thing that I use most of the time.
So now you are working in data science.
Yes.
What is data science?
So data science, okay, probably three big chunks of data science. The first is that you are going to be dealing with a bunch of data, so it's how you're processing that data, but ultimately to make some predictions and to make some decisions. But those are two kind of different branches, right? Like, how am I going to make some forecast of the future? What is that forecast of the future going to be looking like? Is it a single point? Is it a distribution? And given that, how am I going to make some decisions? Is it a simple yes or no decision? Do I need some other model that's going to take all these different factors of that forecast and make some nuanced decision? Data, predictions, decisions. Yeah.
So specifically within a business context, what does that look like day to day? So you get given a bunch of different data points. You use some programming languages to process them and give you some output that then allows a business decision to be made.
Yeah. So my work at the moment, I'm working in energy. So that's a pretty data-rich area. You've got demand, you've got frequency, you've got all these plants that are operating, you've got like a really rich data set that goes back for as long as we've been having to monitor energy generating plants on a national scale. So very rich data. We'll take that and we'll have a look for any signal that we might be interested in, or maybe lots of signals. Often, for what I'm doing, I'm interested in a price signal. I'm looking to forecast a price. So,
what kinds of signals might you be looking for?
So, my day-to-day, I'm typically interested in looking at price in one way or another. And the things that are going to be driving price in my context will be things like demand and supply. I guess that sounds like a little dry economics. There is this really rich historical data set in energy that will have the operation of all these different plants. So I'll just be trying to squash that down into a format that I can pump into the models and get some forecast of price.
You left academia so you could pump into models.
Pump into models, yeah.
Okay.
It sounds pretty dry, right? But like, there is something extremely satisfying about being able to say something about the future that you wouldn't know otherwise, I think.
Okay, so coming from doing a PhD at a leading academic institution and moving into business, again, just as I wouldn't ask you to betray a former employer by slagging them off, I also wouldn't want you to undermine your own skills, but there's a lot of allure around data and data science. To what extent do you feel that your abilities and capacities and skills are being truly used and tested and built day to day? Or relative to working on a PhD, is this something that's way more cookie cutter and straightforward?
I think they are both really difficult in different ways. Yeah. This isn't like some easy path. Not at all. I worked really hard in labs, and there's a grind to having to be there at the fume cupboard. There's no doubt about it. I would say I actually have to think more carefully and use my brain more often than I have done as a research scientist in chemistry, as a data scientist. Yeah, it's really difficult. There's the biggest challenge, which is not an issue in what I was doing. There are areas of research where it would be an issue, is that you can get things wrong without knowing that they're wrong. And so the effort that you have to go to and the tools that you have to develop to understand if what looks right is actually right is, it's really tricky. If I'm doing chemistry, I've made something and it's either there or it's not. It's either like clean or it's not clean. So there was a pretty binary outcome of right and wrong. That not existing in data science creates an enormous amount of challenge and this like real high barrier that you have to overcome to want to be able to put ultimately a bunch of value, a bunch of other people's value at risk to make decisions based on it. So yeah, I don't think it's an easy way out at all.
How much time would you say is spent pondering counterfactuals and things that could have been done differently?
So probably less than if it was a human making the decision. Like the process of developing a model is going to be a long process, right? Like especially in what we'll do, we're typically operating an asset that might have cost like 20-30 million pounds to build. So in that process of building a model to optimize that asset, we're going to be thinking very carefully about it. But the day-to-day, every 5 minutes, every 2 minutes as it's making a decision, we're not laboring over that to the extent that maybe if a human was making that decision, they would be laboring over it. What we will do is like, okay, it's been a period of operation, a month, 6 weeks, whatever it might be. Let's take a real deep dive retrospective and look not at the individual decisions, but the aggregate decision making.
Sure.
And like that we'll labor over, but we spend a lot less time over that than I think it would if we were making the human-driven day-to-day decisions.
So what's your company trying to achieve?
So the company I'm at is Habitat.energy, and they optimize big grid-scale batteries in the UK power market. So lots of people feel passionately about increasing the amount of renewable energy we have in the UK power network. The downside of that is that it's intermittent, and so the solution that's being talked about most often at the moment is to install energy storage, and lithium-ion batteries is one of the primary methods of energy storage available commercially at the moment. So we optimize these really big lithium-ion batteries, not the kind of stuff that you'd be able to install in your home. They're typically made up of loads of these shipping containers stacked sometimes on top of each other, usually next to each other, size of a parking lot there or thereabouts. And we tell them when to charge, when to discharge, and in what markets to help the people who build those batteries recoup the costs of that and hopefully make some gains on their investment as well.
How does your day-to-day directly contribute to that? And what would it look like without your contribution?
So batteries are really, really difficult things to manage. They have peculiar dynamics that haven't been seen in the energy industry before. So in that sense, there's a new problem to be solved. They degrade over time. Like everyone's had a phone that 2 years in like stays charged for 4 hours instead of like 2 days. And that degradation is a feature of lithium-ion batteries, not of your phone battery. So if you've spent £25 million on a battery that is all of a sudden got 50% of its starting capacity, that's a problem. But there are things that you can do over the battery's lifetime that will moderate that. So a lot of what I do is trying to figure out how we can make decisions that are going to prolong the life of that battery and the useful life of that battery. Obviously, these are expensive assets. Someone's paid money for them and people are looking to recoup those costs and make money from that investment. And so a lot of what I do is trying to figure out how we can economically charge and discharge the battery. So making that price forecast. If we weren't doing that, what was before habitat.energy, how people are still trying to operate a lot of batteries is by making those decisions with people. There are advantages and disadvantages to that. I think the advantages of making decisions with people is typically that they have seen more things than a model, and they'll be able to react well to some crazy, like 1 in a million event. You've had some major nationwide blackout, like maybe the model hasn't trained on that, maybe it doesn't know what to do, but like a human will have a decent sense of like, well, I can interpolate between these other events and here's what I think I should do. The downside is humans are pretty fallible. They're prone to their biases and their past experiences, and the models can be a little more precise in their judgments, given
but presumably also still subject to some biases, right?
They can be subject to biases, but I think the biases that they are subject to, at least in the area that I'm looking at, you hear stories of algorithms that are running wild that, you know, maybe you've trained some natural language processing algorithm that it turns out might have racist tendencies, right? Like that's real worries in areas of machine learning. When you have numbers focused models, which is exclusively what I think about, the biases are less problematic and much easier to spot.
Sure. I know that one of the things that drives you is the looming environmental catastrophe and things that you can do to meaningfully contribute to preventing the apocalypse. How, if at all, does your work feed into that overarching ambition?
Yeah. So I think the first priority that is really the keystone that unlocks future development is the ability to generate electricity and generate power in a low carbon fashion, right? Like moving away from the combustion of fossil fuels to generate our electricity. Once you have that electricity, there's a bunch of other stuff that can happen and need to happen. So the electrification of our heating network, the electrification of our vehicular network, like all of that stuff needs to happen, but you can't do it until you have renewable generation on the power network. There are a few different ways that you could go about doing that. You could build lots of nuclear, which is low carbon but has different consequences. You can build lots of solar and lots of wind, and that's what we're doing. And the challenge with building out a lot of that intermittent renewable is that you need to be catering for instances where the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. So you can either really overbuild that, right? You can say, we need to make sure we have enough wind and wind sufficiently widely dispersed that we will always be able to cover demand. And most importantly, cover peak demand. Like peak demand in the UK might be like 50 gigawatts. Like it's an enormous amount of energy that you'll instantaneously need. And you could overbuild to that. That's a pretty expensive option. By making energy storage economic and widely distributed and just like trusted by investors and trusted by National Grid and trusted that it will just like do what people think it's going to do, I think you can get to that electrification of the power network at lower cost and start unlocking all of those subsequent things that need to happen to, as you put it, alleviate the impending apocalypse sooner and at lower cost.
It's a nice fun day out in the park, isn't it? Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about short versus long-term storage?
So there are lots of different ways that I guess markets can operate. Power markets, but markets in general can operate. And depending on how the rules of the markets are set up, you might end up with some desirable consequences, but also some undesirable consequences. In power markets, really common separation in the way we think about things. We might classify a market as pay as clear or pay as bid. And some of these markets are much better for batteries than others, and some of them are really difficult for long-term storage to manage effectively and economically. So if I'm in a market that is pay as clear, then what that means is everybody in the market gets to access the same price. So there's going to be some calculation, and how that calculation is done might vary from market to market, but ultimately everybody in the market is going to get that clearing price. Or we could say this market is pay as bid. That's like an auction, right? Like on eBay, I'm going to put in some price, and if it is accepted, then I'm going to pay that price that I auctioned in, that I bid in. In the UK, most batteries operate in a market that's pay as clear. And if you imagine a pay as clear market over a full day, to a first approximation, you're going to have one peak price and one trough price, one highest price and one lowest price. And a battery is a storage system, so it's going to have to choose when to charge and when to discharge. That price is going to sit around for a fixed amount of time. In the UK, that's 30 minutes. And so you have a 30-minute period where you want to charge and a 30-minute period when you want to discharge. So ideally, to make the most money, your battery would be 30 minutes in duration. If you have a battery that lasts more than 30 minutes, let's say it lasts 8 hours, now you have to charge not just at the lowest price, but also at the second lowest price, and the third lowest, and the fourth, right through to the 8th lowest price, and do the same thing on discharging. And so, as an asset that needs to profit from the spread between prices, it's really difficult for long-duration storage to profit in these pay-as-clear markets, which is where most of the batteries are currently operating in the UK. The tricky thing is, long-duration storage has such an important role to play in facilitating low-carbon generation in UK power. Like, we imagine all that solar that's generating during the day that we kind of want to shift into later in the evening, during that evening peak. That's something that long-duration storage would be really well suited to doing, but the economic signal to do that is a bit misaligned in these pay-as-clear markets. You can have markets that might work better for this long-duration storage, like the pay-as-bid markets. These can be better suited to making that economic case work. In a pay-as-clear market, then I can say, I'm willing to charge at this price, I'm willing to discharge at this price. And if whoever is operating that system thinks like, yeah, you're providing a really valuable service, we care about that, we are willing to pay for that price, then maybe you can do better. But that's not where most batteries are operating in the UK. In Australia, where we've also spent a bunch of time working and building models, it's also not a pay-as-bid market. So there's a challenge here around how to incentivize people building long-duration storage. How do you set up that price signal so that people want to do that it makes sense for them to do that investment goes into that? Because we feel like that's something important. We should convince people that it is.
Can you talk about the current state of battery technology?
So it's still a pretty new technology in the grand scheme of things. When we're talking about the 90s, really, that this that lithium-ion in its current form was really brought to the fore, right? Like, this is, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively new technology, and there's still a huge amount of development to come in every piece, every component of that battery's like fabrication makeup. We've seen massive drops in cost for unit storage and unit power. We've seen massive increases in how much energy we can store at a given weight. But there are some really big limitations still. We are having to use a bunch of rare materials and materials from dubious sources in the construction of our batteries, especially cobalt, which is a key component in a bunch of these batteries. Like, it would be great if we could remove that, but right now that is an integral part of the cathode in the batteries. We still have this really significant degradation that we have to deal with that means a typical battery's lifetime, even when it has been specifically manufactured to have a long lifetime, might be 10 years or less, depending on how we operate it. That's not great if you're spending a bunch of money on it. Like, if I was building a nuclear power plant, I'd expect it to last decades, not like a decade. And the components of the batteries, if you have anything go wrong, which you would hope it doesn't, but occasionally does, are extremely toxic. There was, unfortunately, recently a fire just a few days ago in the UK of a battery by a big European renewables company just went up in flames. And one of the key components of the battery in the electrolyte is a highly fluorinated compound that, when it comes into contact with heat and water, can release hydrogen fluoride, which is an extremely toxic compound that...
They're turning the frickin' frogs gay.
Those batteries, it's all a conspiracy.
Okay, yeah, sorry, yeah, carry on.
So they can be, they contain super toxic compounds.
Yikes.
So it would be great if we could eliminate those toxic components, if we could increase the lifetime of the batteries, and if we can improve the unit storage per weight and per volume. Like, those would be amazing things to continue developing. And there's a bunch of new technology that is being worked on in that area, but it's pretty expensive.
Who is Nate Silver, and what do you think of Nate Silver?
Nate Silver is a statistician who uses the tools of probability and statistics to create models of political outcomes. He was most famous for correctly calling the 2008-2012 US elections.
Down to the state level, more or less.
Yeah. And equally as famous for miscalling the 2016 election in favor of Hillary Clinton. I think I am so the blog that he runs is called 538, which I always get mixed up with 568, which is a number of millimeters
in a pint.
In a pint, exactly, but is 538. I just think the guy is super cool because he was ahead of the curve in bringing a really data-driven approach to an area that hadn't been particularly data-driven. Right? Like, he saw this was an area of punditry and of just humans saying things off the cuff and like being held with a microphone to them, like, tell me what you think about this new development and this new hearsay. And he really brought data to it, and he looked at polls and he looked at the biases of polls, and he said, okay, this is good, this is bad, and it's bad in this way and in this quantified way. Here's what we can say in aggregate. I think that is super cool to take such unstructured data and to bring some structured insight to it.
So Nate Silver says that data science isn't a new field and it's just another name for statistics.
Yeah, I think I think that is mostly right. However, there are some exceptions. I think data science is definitely statistics in large part rebranded. But what it also does, I think it does separate itself from statistics in focusing more explicitly on data and focusing more explicitly on decision making. Like, statistics has tools for asking questions about data and creating models, but doesn't have tools about, like, how should I aggregate hundreds of gigabytes of data and how should I process that in an efficient way to make a model predictive. And taking those predictions, what are some ways that I can make decisions based on that data? Like, what's an effective strategy for making a decision based on data? That's like, these have typically been different areas. Like, the data you might have called that, I don't know, like data warehousing or database engineering, like that kind of stuff. The decision making you might have called operational research or something along those lines. But now this has really been brought under a single umbrella of data science, which is like, we care about the pipeline, give us huge amounts of data, build statistical models, and make decisions based on it. That is, I think, the power of data science and what hasn't necessarily been addressed with statistics before.
And beyond batteries and the work that you're doing at the moment, are there other spaces out there that employ the same set of tools within data science for other interesting problems?
So, interestingly, I think one of the biggest areas of overlap would be in other models that are trading in markets. You might not think there's like the most overlap between the systematic, like quantitative hedge fund based out in New York that's trading on options and derivatives and, like, I don't know, driving fancy cars and buying extortionate art. But like the tools that they developed back in the 80s and 90s to trade equities and that arms race that occurred over those decades are now being exported wholesale into power markets and into optimizing batteries and then making batteries a viable technology in today's markets. There is exactly the same kind of characteristics that you saw in the stock market, where the images that you have of people shouting across the room at each other and saying, like, buy, 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 sell, sell, sell. It's like that kind of thing with less of the bravado in the power markets right now in most of the world. It's people, individuals, making a decision to charge or discharge or to run your power plant at 400 rather than 500 megawatts. And all of that is just ripe for optimization and for bringing that data-driven modeling to. And I think it's going to be a huge area of disruption in areas where you have liberalized power markets. And I think it's going to be such a big price signal for the innovative new technologies that we need to see for the electrification of power, that will be a major driver for liberalization of power markets that aren't yet liberalized. We're seeing a lot of this in Asia, where you have nationalized power markets that are saying, okay, we're trying to incentivize the development of these like capitally intensive products, the wind, the storage, the solar that we need to decarbonize our power systems, but it's difficult when we're a nationalized industry to do that. So I would be optimistic that these tools are not just going to deliver the same output at lower cost, but also hopefully just bring the international like energy community along with it.
So I'm conscious that a lot of the smart people we know are working in the private sector, and that's great. And there's a definite case to be made for any sort of grander environmental ambitions that you have benefiting from having smart people working on these problems. I'm curious if you know of any other industries that would benefit from approaches in data science that might not have the people currently doing it, or are there any opportunities to use data science for social good?
So, less on the second question, but this is something that has been on my mind a bunch these last few months. Shipping. Shipping is like one of those industries that is extremely manual and human-centric and is managed by brokers who allocate cargo and tell it that fill the ships, make sure the ships are at capacity to go from A to B. And it's also one of the major sources of pollution, not just because of the volume of traffic that you have, but also the looser regulations you have around shipping fuel. I think bringing models and bringing data science to that industry and making sure that we can fill those ships at higher capacity, reduce the number of trips that you're able to do, and to transit that more effectively, I think that is both not really being done to any great extent right now, but also potentially really high impact. There are a few of the big shipbrokers in London who are now starting to explore the use of shipping platforms and providing a marketplace to have the ship charterers and the cargo hauliers matching them up. But I think there's a huge opportunity there to bring like a really rigorous, data-driven approach to more effectively move goods around the globe at a lower environmental cost.
Duncan, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I look forward to picking your brains about whatever it is you turn your attention to next.
Thank you very much.
Before I let you bounce, though, you know there's a quick fire round. Okay. Which emerging field or technology are you most excited about?
Quantum computers.
Why?
So, as a chemist, coming from a background in chemistry, one of the big challenges we had was modeling chemicals in computers. Quantum computers more effectively describe the kind of like computational building blocks of those things. You can like more accurately describe all of those basis functions that and the wave function of those molecules. So what it will mean that we can do is we can accurately or even exactly model chemicals and the reactions of chemicals, removing the need for a huge amount of lab work, a huge amount of just trial and error that people are doing in fume cupboards right now. Just automate it, get it on those quantum computers. Like it's of all the sciences, I think by far the most manual and the least computerized right now. And I think quantum computers are just going to completely transform the way we explore materials and reactions and catalysis.
Is there a tool that you use in your work that you're particularly fond of?
There's this one tool. It's a package for determining whether something's important or not to a model. For anyone that's into data science, I could not recommend it more highly. It's called Baruta, and it will say, okay, you've given me 100 input features. Of those input features, 20 of these are important, and they're important with a certainty p-value less than 0.05. And it's just so good. There's a lot of tools that purport to do this. A lot of the models that you'll use will have some built-in function to do it, but this is just by far the best thing that I've used. It's a cracker.
If you could wave a magic wand and shift our collective thinking on one thing, what would it be?
I think it would...
COVID isn't real.
That was Chris, not me. I think it would be some of the rhetoric around renewable energy and its limitations. I think there's a real perception that it's it's a no-go. I think people are really convinced of the inability of it to satisfy all our requirements, and actually it's really good now, and it's being built at scale. And if people give it the space to develop and are willing to accept its faults, but also like accept the technologies that are there to fix its faults, like, man, we would be in a way better place. We don't need the coal and the nuclear and the gas. Like, we'll be okay.
What's one thing that everyone should do after listening to this?
Go, put the kettle on, make a nice cup of tea.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, hey, would you like a cup of tea? And they go, oh my God, fuck yes, I would fucking love a cup of tea, thank you. Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, hey, would you like a cup of tea? And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea, or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no thank you, then don't make them tea. At all.
Dr. Duncan Fraser, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into WonderLabs. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who you think might enjoy it. You can also email us at wonderlabspod@gmail.com. This is your host, Chris Richardson. Our brand was designed by Lloyd Preston Allen, and our jingle was produced by T. Fitzgerald at For The Record. You can find more music from For The Record at soundcloud.com/WEAREFTR. Special thanks go out to Liliana Laborde-Dozian. We'll see you next time.